What follows is a conversation I had recently with musicologist, programmer, and cultural historian Joseph Horowitz. Links to his blog and website are in the description box below. Joe is one of the most knowledgeable and insightful writers about music in the world today, a cultural historian with an amazing grasp of American history and an all around cool guy to talk to. It's a very freewheeling conversation. We just sort of started. We talk about conductors, orchestras, programming, music, history, a little bit about cultural politics, and do a few little thought experiments, a few little what ifs, so that we can understand better maybe how classical music and society got to where they are today. So hope you enjoy.
The world as we know it is disappearing on us.
That's that's what we're here to talk about. But man, it's grim. it's it's really
And
grim.
you're in the UK,
Yeah,
which is at least as grim, I take it, as the US.
I think it is, and we just had news today that the promised investigation into the state of Arts Council England that the Labour government had put in their manifesto has been canceled at the moment, which is a blow to everyone in the music world, of course. There's a sort of vague promise that they're going to do a more broad assessment of arts funding in the country. But I mean, it's been a very dark summer here with lots and
Will
lots
there
of
be a change
right
of
wing.
personnel at the top of the Arts Council?
Well, I mean, the the labor leaders, I think, genuinely believe in the principle of arm's length funding organizations, which the Tories were very cynical about. But the upshot of that is that I think at a moment when there's a sense that ACE needs help and intervention, uh, that labor is sort of instinctively reluctant to get involved in that process. Um, but in a way, I don't think the arts in the UK can sit back and wait for these institutions to reform themselves from within because we will all be out of work. I mean, Welsh National Opera, which is just 5 minutes from my house here, and where many of my friends and colleagues work, it's the busiest touring opera in Europe. It's one of the main organizations tasked with not just providing great opera performances in the capital city of Wales, but also in taking opera on the road to Liverpool and Birmingham and Oxford and Bristol and all sorts of other places. They're just about to lose their full-time orchestra and full-time chorus if something isn't done in the next few days. So it's a five-alarm fire for the arts in this country.
Yeah, well, things are bad here as well. Uh, some of the reasons are similar. I'm going back to South Africa. My trip is confirmed. That's an interesting topic because the fate of classical music in South Africa is complex and in some ways similar to the fate of classical music in the United States, in some ways not. There is a man there named Bongani Tembe who is the CEO and artistic director of four orchestras:
Wow.
Durban, Johannesburg, the National Orchestra, and the New African Youth Orchestra. And he gets money from the government. I'll tell you two stories that I learned recently about Mr. Tembe, who I will certainly be meeting. The first is about Nelson Mandela. This is a very pertinent story. We could spend the next hour just talking about this story. So Tembe is a South African who was studying at Juilliard in the 1990s. He was studying voice. And Mandela, who was taking over the country as head of state, was in New York and met with Tembe. And he said, instead of pursuing a career in Europe or the United States, I want you to go back to South Africa, and I'm handing you a mission to transform classical music into something congruent with the new South Africa. And Tembe did. Mandela had the same meeting with a rugby player, and the South African rugby team is now not only one of the strongest in the world, but it's interracial. And Tembe, we've never in this country had a Black American as empowered in classical music and its institutional evolution as Tembe. I mean, not even close. And, you know, he understands his mission. I don't know enough about it, but I will learn as much as I can. The National Orchestra has musicians from all over the country, and they do regional workshops. And I will be meeting some of these musicians, and I'm interested to understand how they experience their mission. So you have an enormous Black presence. It doesn't necessarily infiltrate audiences. You know, South Africa had classical music galore under apartheid and before. They had opera companies, they had orchestras, but it was all colonialist. It was essentially, but not exclusively, white. And then, fascinatingly, they have for for, for forever they've had this Black choral tradition based in the church, which has been impacted by Western oratorio tradition and even American indigenous African American music, so that under apartheid, even these choruses in the townships would be singing Handel and Haydn and Mendelssohn. And nowadays, they're also singing opera. These are people who sing. It's a part of their daily lives to a degree that we don't know in the US. And I was in an airport in Johannesburg, and there was a group of school children in uniform going through security, and they were singing, you know, they were singing
Lovely.
in harmony a song they knew. So there are enormous challenges there, not the least financial challenges, but there seems to be a pretty good awareness that when you import classical music someplace, you need to make it your own. And that's what didn't happen in the United States. And now these chickens that are coming home to roost are the chickens that I've been writing about since the 1980s, for which I was initially vilified. But now that I've turned into a prophet, I'm simply ignored.
So when you first started writing about this issue and you were being vilified, what were you saying and what was the response?
Oh, well, the vilification was provoked by a specific cause. It was my book, 1987, Understanding Toscanini, How He Became an American Culture God and Helped Create a New Audience for Old Music. Undoubtedly the most vilified book about classical music in living memory in the United States. Although a lot of people also praised it. It was immensely controversial and also very, very thoroughly reviewed in the UK. And what it said was, when classical music was popularized after World War I, when the arts were democratized, when the new middle classes were brought into the arts community, they were sold a bill of goods, which was, what is classical music? Dead European masters. And the iconic representation of that was the Toscanini cult, because Americans believed that Toscanini was the world's greatest living musician. This is the first time that a performer, rather than a composer, was anointed the world's greatest living musician, and that's a sea change. Toscanini was not, okay, he's a great conductor, but not even an American citizen. And really, you know, he acquired quite a bit of American music for a guy in his 80s, but he's no Koussevitzy. So this is a very, very dangerous development, in some ways even fatal. People hated this book because they still were in love with Toscanini in the 1980s. These people are now gone for the most part, but there was an enormous groundswell of music lovers for whom Toscanini remained a god. And he was indeed sacralized. He was called Vicar of the Immortals and, you know, priest of music and stuff like that. So
So
why did this happen? Just one more thought,
Yeah,
Ken,
yeah.
because it bears on interesting differences between the UK and the US. When we democratized classical music, this was a commercial operation. There was no government money. The idea of an American BBC, which was floated in Congress in the 30s, was defeated. So you have two figures who sort of embody what happened. One is David Sarnoff, the other is Arthur Judson. Arthur Judson, who's the main power broker running the New York Philharmonic, running Columbia Artists Management, is a self declared music businessman. And he says right out that the audience sets taste. Never before was this criterion suggested by a musical leader in the United States. It was always the leader who sets taste, not the audience. So that was Judson. And Sarnoff, who was a visionary running RCA and NBC, had very old fashioned tastes in music. He loved European music by dead composers. So we're talking about an enormous conglomerate that runs a radio station, an orchestra, um, that produces recordings, books galore, music appreciation guides. His whole effort was about Beethoven and Brahms and Verdi and Wagner. It had very little to do with contemporary music or American music, or indeed making music. The idea of making music, singing, amateur music making in the home was actually explicitly denigrated. People were told to listen to recordings and listen to the radio. So that's that's how it all started.
I suppose there was a commercial impetus behind record companies and people at RCA and NBC to say, you know, you don't want to spend your evenings stood around the spinet with your family, sight reading things at the piano when you can listen to
The
people on
professionals,
the
yeah,
radio.
the great listen to the great artists make music. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is actually explicit. Hard to believe. My most recent book on the Cultural Cold War, Propaganda of Freedom, I have occasion in that book to compare what was going on in Soviet Russia. There's a book by a woman named Pauline Fairclough about how classical music was popularized in the Soviet Union. It's a mixed bag, but they got a few things right.
Hmm.
Uh, they had orchestras and choruses and even opera companies and factories. That never happened in the US.
Yeah.
And they prioritized Russian music, new and old. And that never happened in the US.
And that, to an extent, did happen in the UK in
Of
the
course,
years in particular. You know, you had people
sure.
like Barbaroli taking the Halle to factory concerts and stuff, and you know, free performances for workers who were endeavoring to make the machinery that would supposedly bring victory in the war. Um, and you know, you look now where you know Britain has the same crisis of classical music being perceived or described as elitist in a certain way.
Gee.
That wasn't always the case. You know, that's been allowed to uh, go unchallenged for a while, to the point now that people don't know that history of how some of these organizations were set up and originally intended to work. I want to back up to Toscanini for just a second because that book was my first encounter with your name and your writing, and it made a big impression on me at the time. One of the things about Toscanini that I've never found a satisfactory answer for in my own mind is really why he essentially won out of that generation, out of that historical moment. I mean, if you look at his near peers and contemporaries, people like Stokowski and Koussevitzy to start with, I mean, both of them had a much more important and enduring legacy of things like creating institutions that have actually lasted to a certain extent, building the Philadelphia Orchestra into what it was. For Koussevitzy, the body of commissions, you know, of really significant repertoire pieces that have changed, you know, orchestral repertoire for the whole world. And Stokowski, I think, still probably holds the record for the most premieres of new works of any American based conductor and, contributions across a huge range of musical styles. And yet, you know, the Toscanini model per se is the modern American orchestral model in terms of repertoire, uh, in spite of the fact that the NBC Symphony didn't survive after he was gone. And as you said, the repertoire was very, very small. And out of that handful of composers that you mentioned, I think it's only in Verdi, perhaps, that you can say he was one of the greats of all time at that particular repertoire. So is it is it these power brokers that ensured that he won the war for the future, or was it something about his personality, or is it just a sad accident of history?
I was just jotting some notes, reminding myself what's in the book, which got people so upset. I use a term, I don't remember it precisely, about generating maximum possible excitation. I mean, the way he made music, especially as an older man, was about surface tension and precision and just heat, sheer heat. So that maximizes your audience because anybody can lock into that. You don't have to know anything. You can just feel the stress, feel the tension, which is extraordinary. He also, so that appeals to mass taste, and so did his personality. Again, it's easy to understand. This is a guy who's totally driven by his mission to make, to intensely convey music. Uh, much much easier to lock into than a Koussevitzy or Stokowsky. Uh, and he's a refugee from Italy. He does not relinquish his Italian citizenship. He he turns his back on Bayreuth, which is to say on Hitler. He denounces the Germans. He denounces Mussolini. There's all this wartime stuff that's going on as well. It would be an interesting thought experiment to subtract him from the American scene. And then you're looking basically at Koussevitzy and Stokowsky, the two guys you mentioned, who are completely different from Toscanini and quite different from one another. Um, Tanglewood. Imagine Koussevitsky created Tanglewood as we know it. Well, no, he created Tanglewood as he knew it was, which was as an experimental laboratory for American music, something it no longer is.
Mhm.
And indeed, the music directors of the Boston Symphony never embraced Tanglewood to the degree that Koussevitsky did. He regarded that as his major legacy. It's very hard to grasp the magnitude of this achievement. He imagine a conductor doing that,
Yeah.
creating Tanglewood and Stokowsky, as you mentioned. I mean, just look at a list of the works that he premiered. It's just jaw dropping, and yet he had an audience that filled the Academy of Music. It doesn't true that the audience sets taste, as Arthur Judson claimed. Stokowsky set taste. Koussevitsky set taste. So, Ken, what would have happened in the United States had there been no Toscanini? You would have had to market Stokowsky or Koussevitsky. Harder to do. I guess Stokowsky easier to market than Koussevitsky. And where would that have led? Somewhere different, It's very hard to say. Stokowsky also had a big mission to inspire young people. He
Mhm.
he conducted his own young people's concerts. He created youth concerts. This was a big part because he felt that young people were more open. He said this so many times, more open-minded. Uh, that the older people were hopeless. They didn't like the music he was programming, but he wanted to cultivate a young audience that would be open-eared. And he's a very complex phenomenon. There's an element of the showman. I don't think there's an element of the charlatan, but a lot of people thought that as well. He wasn't as obviously an exemplar of integrity as Toscanini. Toscanini was about doing exactly what the composer said. So he's actually advertising his own integrity. Stokowski didn't care about integrity. It wasn't part of his vocabulary. So I don't know. Uh, what do you think would have happened if there was no Toscanini?
That's a really interesting question because if you go just sort of like a half generation later, you can already see in figures like Zell and Reiner a similarity in
Totally.
that
Yeah,
it's
that was
all about the perfection of the performance,
absolutely. Yeah.
rigor,
Look
discipline,
at
structure.
Heifetz.
Yeah.
Maximum possible excitation. Also, that's Vladimir Horowitz.
Hmm.
Uh, we really got caught up in a listening template, which is not to be found with Koussevitzy and Stokowski.
Yeah.
It's certainly not about precision.
I would certainly say with someone like Horowitz, what you have is a also kind of a an element of almost the beauty of the insane in his playing, that there is a fantastical element to it in a sense, that he's willing to take huge risks at the piano in a way that Zal would never uh, do on the podium, I think.
He's an odd fit, and he suffered.
Yeah.
First of all, Toscanini was his father-in-law, but he stopped playing transcriptions and showpieces. He felt the need to fit in to a musical environment that was really not his at all.
I completely agree. And I think in his case, he felt very uncomfortable with being billed as, the virtuoso with the greatest technique in the world. Uh, he was never he was a virtuoso in the sense of generating excitement, but not precision. Um, and yeah, I think especially the way that he ended up in Toscanini's circle can't have been particularly healthy for him as a performer.
Buried in Milan.
To come back to the question of, what would have happened
Hmm.
if not for Toscanini. I mean, you look at after Toscanini's retirement, there was an attempt to install Stokowski at the NBC Symphony and to rebrand it, which didn't really work. And it's not really clear if Stokowski, in a way, like didn't have the energy at that point in his life to carry that to success, or was, you know, I mean, Stokowski's just a very interesting figure because on the one hand, you know, the recordings that he made even in the 1970s are thrilling. I mean, they're
Well, he
really,
coveted the New York Philharmonic, Ken.
yeah.
That was the plan that he, in the 40s, that he would become the music director of the New York Philharmonic. It went nowhere. And it could be that he was just too incongruous, too odd,
Yeah.
uh, in a way too glamorous to I couldn't tell you whether he would have been a successful music director of the New York Philharmonic.
Yeah, I mean, he had a lot of success in Houston and, obviously in Philadelphia. Why he wouldn't have worked there? I mean, the New York Philharmonic is really the toughest orchestra in the world for conductors. I mean, I think, they've had that reputation for a long, long
Well,
time.
Judson was still there. Nobody could work successfully with Judson. This is a long story. Judson and Barbaroli, Judson and Stokowski, Judson and Metropolis. I mean, the best story about Judson is that Metropolis, when he programmed the American premiere of Mahler's Sixth Symphony, a work he considered a masterpiece, Judson told him that he would not be permitted to perform it on the Sunday afternoon concert, because that concert was nationally broadcast. And Judson did not want to nationally broadcast the American premiere of Mahler Sixth. He wanted to replace it with the Gershwin Piano Concerto. And Metropolis said to him in a letter, you can read it, I'm begging you on my knees. And Judson said, no, forget it. And they did the Gershwin Piano Concerto. So that's an environment in which really no conductor could prosper. And when Judson was fired by the board, that is when Bernstein was hired, and Bernstein had a mandate. That's another story. I mean, that didn't work either, but we can understand why Stokowsky couldn't work with Arthur Judson when he wanted to become the music director of the New York Philharmonic. Had there been another manager of the Philharmonic, a lot of things could have happened differently if you replaced Toscanini with these two guys. We should also mention Dmitri Metropolis, a great conductor who was not about precision, in many ways completely anathema to Toscanini and the conductors you mentioned, Fritz Reiner, George Sell. You could add Eric Leinsdorf.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's quite a tangled tale.
When I'm teaching conducting, I often talk to the students about dividing their work on the podiums loosely into two areas, one of which I call tuning the piano, which is the, putting the orchestra together, getting the woodwind section playing in tune, getting the strings starting at the same time, all that kind of nuts and bolts stuff, and then painting the picture, the phrasing, the shaping, the colors, all of that. Um, and of course, not all conductors, in fact, I would say relatively few conductors excel at both. Uh, and I think Metropolis for me is, of the great conductors, maybe the least interested in tuning the piano of just about
Yeah,
everything I can think of,
yeah.
which in a sense is, you almost wish he had like a really amazing assistant conductor who could prepare the orchestras for him, especially some of his later stuff. I think he was a little bit more meticulous in his Minnesota years than at the New York Philharmonic in terms of just working on the nitty gritty stuff. It's a pity that more of that later recorded legacy of his isn't at a higher technical
Well,
standard.
you're a Mahler conductor. What do you
Yeah,
make of Metropolis as a Mahler conductor?
it's very much the kind of primal experience that I think that music is supposed to be. I mean, there is a sense with it that it could all collapse at any moment. Um, and but I think that's something that we miss in tamer performances. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a fan of just about everything he did, um, other than, the kind of tendency towards somewhat ropey instrumental playing. On the other hand, a bit like Horowitz, I mean, he could coax a kind of almost unimaginable virtuosity from orchestras whenever everything worked as it should. A few years ago, I did Schoenberg's own orchestration of the his second string quartet, which is relatively rarely done, and I could only find two recordings of the piece, one by Esa-Pekka Salonen and Metropolis's. And
Is that the live NBC Symphony Metropolis?
I think it is, yeah.
Because that's an extremely intense and sloppy performance.
It's sloppy, but boy, it's thrilling.
I'm
Um,
not criticizing it. I'm a Metropolis guy.
yeah. He's another one, that also made an impression on his musicians like almost no one else I can think of. I mean, yeah, I worked a lot when I was young with Gunther Schuller, who didn't have a lot positive stuff to say about most conductors, but he just absolutely revered Metropolis. For the ear, for the imagination, for the
I knew
integrity.
Gunther well. In fact, he was kind of a de facto advisor to me when I wrote about any of these guys because he played as a horn player under Reiner, under Sell, under Metropolis, under Bernstein. He told me all kinds of things. He actually had a pretty wide, he liked Reiner, you know, even, and he writes about music in a way that you would think would not be conducive to appreciating Metropolis. But Metropolis was a god for him.
Yeah.
And one of the things he told me was the decline of the Philharmonic, uh, which eventually became apparent, happened under Bernstein and not under Metropolis. The playing standard, and I think that's true from what little I know from broadcasts. Um, We didn't talk yet about the Metropolis, Minneapolis, Mahler one. What do you make of that?
I haven't listened to it in ages, so I'll throw it back to you. What do you make of it?
To me, it's the most inspiring Mahler performance I know, and it's not clean, but boy, is it intense and very extreme interpretively. Like, for instance, he begins the scherzo under tempo. I don't think anybody else does that.
It. I mean, others have tried. Dudamel,
Really?
when he did it
Who was
with
that?
Angeles, yeah, Gustavo Dudamel of all
Oh,
folks,
uh-huh. Yeah.
uh, in his live PBS concert 10 years ago, whenever that
Oh,
was,
uh-huh.
uh, did it, but it didn't. In it felt like a thing stamped onto the performance instead of coming
Not
from.
not
Yeah,
with the. I mean, if you listen to 1 minute of this first ever recording, 1940, of Mahler's First Symphony, listen to the opening of the scherzo, and and listen to those double basses attacking their instruments under tempo, and then he brings it up. It's astounding.
I think you make a really important point there that things like tempo manipulations and nuances and stuff need to be connected not only to things like the phrase structure, but also the sound that the orchestra's
I
making.
just I don't know that anything remotely like this performance is possible today. It is so off the wall, like the accelerando at the end of the first movement, or the klezmer episode in the slow movement. the things he's doing, uh, I just, when have we ever heard, maybe from Tenstead, occasionally you would hear this kind of intensity, but it was never as ragged. Metropolis is really ragged. And also the subito dynamics, the extremes of of piano and forte, the instability of the pulse. And that's it's not even a live performance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's just,
You don't hear this when he gets to the Philharmonic to anywhere near the same degree.
yeah, you don't get the feeling he ever quite had the Philharmonic behind him in the same way.
Sometimes they couldn't help but go along with him. Did you ever hear the live Rachmaninoff symphonic dances that
No.
Metropolis did with Philharmonic? That's that's a performance. You said something a few minutes ago about Metropolis's performances when the musicians succumb.
Hmm.
Yeah, they're on board for that. They
Yeah.
can't help themselves. Schuller told me that when Metropolis was really intense, his eyes would cross.
Amazing. Have you seen the film of Metropolis rehearsing I think it's the Liszt Faust Symphony?
Yes, I have.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's just amazing and gorgeous. And there's more excitement in that than there is in, 90 minutes of most other conductors working on stronger repertoire. I want to come back to Bernstein for a moment and do another thought experiment.
yeah,
We've had the thought, what if there was no Toscanini? But what if Bernstein had gone to Boston instead of New York?
right. In 1950, which is when Koussevitzy wanted him to become his successor, and Bernstein was conducting the Boston Symphony a lot in 48 and 49. And he was doing interesting repertoire, of course. And he programmed Mahler too in two separate seasons. I read, I forget where, that Bernstein didn't want at that stage in his career to become the music director of the Boston Symphony, but certainly Koussevitsky wanted him to do so. Um, this thought experiment is not new to me. Certainly, it would have been far more logical for him to be the conductor of the Boston Symphony than the New York Philharmonic, not just because he was a native of Massachusetts, but because he was Koussevitsky's boy. And Koussevitsky had already created an institution dedicated to American music and new music, which the Philharmonic certainly was not. Um, he was not a ripe conductor in 1950, right? But even so, it's an irresistible thought experiment because here's an orchestra whose board just decided to make a sharp turn, like happened to the Baltimore Symphony when David Zinman was replaced by Yuri Timirkanov, or which happens to the New York Philharmonic every time they announce a new. I mean, imagine naming Pierre Boulez the successor to Leonard Bernstein. There's no continuity. So I think it's an important thought experiment. Uh, Bernstein taking over the Boston Symphony and inheriting Koussevitzy's legacy and really pumping for American music. I'll tell you my two favorite thought experiments in the history of American classical music.
Okay.
One is that Gershwin lives as long as Copland, and the
Mhm.
other is that Mahler performs a Knives Symphony as music director of the New York Philharmonic. Either one of those things would have changed the narrative completely.
And both are close enough to a believable reality that it's not,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah. No.
a bit of improved medical care, and it could so easily have happened. Yeah, I think if you imagine, the Boston Symphony with this incredible infrastructure of Tanglewood and this legacy of commissioning, the Bartoks and the Messiaens and the Respigis as part of the heart of the orchestra in Bernstein's hands. I mean, I think it would have changed the repertoire of all American orchestras.
Yes, I agree. if he would have realized his dream, which was that the basic repertoire would become American. That was what he tried to do with the New York Philharmonic, but not possible. It would have been actually possible in Boston to do that.
Yeah, it's a sadly missed opportunity, and I think he would have been in many ways. I hate to say better conductor, but I think his gifts as a conductor would have been more eloquently balanced by the BSO as an orchestra, as a I don't like the expression an instrument when you're talking about human beings, but
Um,
I think their best qualities and his best qualities and their worst qualities and his worst qualities would have probably been a slightly healthier mix in the long run, at least for him, I think. But I mean, at least as you say, they're it's only a thought experiment. So. Um, here's another thought experiment. Going back to the sort of what you were saying about making classical music American. I want to ask you about one of your heroes, which is Anton Seidel, and the thought experiment of if he lived to be Stokowski's age or Toscanini's age
no.
and still conducting. I mean, I think probably you should sort of précis this, but for listeners to this, giving a little introduction of who he was and what he achieved when he was in New York, because this is history that
Well, he
even
was bigger than Bernstein. He was bigger than Toscanini. He was the central figure in the Wagnerism movement in the United States. He premiered, he gave the American premieres of Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger, Goethe Dämmerung, Siegfried, Rheingold, all conducted for the first time in the United States by Wagner's own protege, a man who lived in Wagner's house for 7 years, who was arguably the greatest Wagner conductor of his generation and the most intensely charismatic personality you can imagine. He conducted at Coney Island 14 times a week in the summer, twice a day. Think about that. Uh, the music pavilion, 3,000 seats, would be filled for all Wagner concerts um, on the water. Just one thing after another is just mind-boggling. He premiered the New World Symphony by his friend Dvorak. He premiered the Victor Herbert Second Cello Concerto, and Herbert was his own protege and frequent assistant conductor. And Seidel was a man uh, cloaked in mystery, uh, handsome, uh, inscrutable, silent. The door was always open to American composers. He was a big advocate for American music. He advocated Wagner in English. The big what might have been here, Ken, is that had he not died, there would have been a Wagner festival established in Brooklyn by the Seidel Society, as important as Bayreuth, because he is at least as authentic a successor to Wagner as was Cosimo. I mean, he was Wagner's boy. So imagine during World War II when you have Bayreuth overtaken by the Nazis and swastikas, if you had an equally pedigreed Wagner festival in Brooklyn, which had nothing to do with what Germany had become, it would have changed the reputation of Wagner. So this is a man who died at the age of 47, a death experienced as an American catastrophe. Uh, People couldn't imagine continuing operatic and symphonic music in the city of New York absent Anton Seidel. His funeral was held at the Metropolitan Opera House. Uh, Women linked their arms and forced their way into the house. A policeman on a horse was overturned. The house was flooded to twice its normal capacity. Everybody was crying, including Henry Craybill, who gave a eulogy in place of Karl Shorsky, who was too moved to speak. So, yeah, this was something of enormous weight and influence that was suddenly terminated. He had no successor. at the Philharmonic or at the Metropolitan Opera. It all ended suddenly in 1898.
Uh, of course, given the moment at which he died, we don't have any recorded evidence of what he was like
Nothing,
as a performer.
nothing.
Um, but from what you've read, and I mean, there was a very strong critical establishment in New York at the
That's
time,
right. Yeah.
very perceptive and smart people like Craybiel. Um, what do you think was the secret sauce of his musicianship? Was it a Toscanini-esque surface tension and intensity, or was it a
His
different?
Bible was Wagner's book on conducting.
Mhm.
Everything's there. So Wagner says the minuet of the Eighth Symphony by Beethoven has to be slow. Seidel took the minuet of the Eighth Symphony slow. Um, Wagner is an apostle of tempo change. Craybill once notated with metronome markings the tempos of Theodore Thomas and Anton Seidel in Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. Not just the movements, but even parts of the movements. It's all there.
Fascinating.
Uh, Thomas is the Urtex guy, so Seidel is much faster in the finale, much slower in the second movement, faster in the third movement, slower at the beginning. An enormous latitude of tempo compared to Theodore Thomas, and we know the tempo was always changing. So, and he's an intensely inspirational conductor. People were hypnotized by him. He cast a spell over the player.
Do you think in that sense it was more about his the magnitude of his specific gifts than actually sort of the fact that he was this kind of a conductor, that he was just more talented, more charismatic, more energetic, more persuasive.
Well, no, he had a very specific identity. Um, like his Don Giovanni was never funny,
Hmm.
very weighty, slow. Uh, he was a Wagner conductor. I mean, he conducted as he heard and observed Wagner conducting. He was a disciple of Wagner as a conductor.
Hmm.
And Wagner was a great conductor, a controversial conductor. We know a lot about Wagner as a conductor, and it all fits Seidel like a glove.
Along the lines of your Mahler conducts Ives, can you imagine Seidel conducting Mahler or Seidel conducting Ives?
It's so hard to know. He's 47 years old when he dies in 1898. So modernism is is hardly on the horizon. He never conducted an ode of Mahler. He never conducted a what he conducted Richard Strauss and Bruckner, right? That's as far as he gets. Um, he conducted a fair amount of American music. He's a romantic. He's a German romantic. So how would he have responded to Mahler? Some German conductors never get to Mahler because they're Bruckner conductors.
Yeah.
Seidel is a Bruckner conductor, right?
Mm.
So he may have wound up sticking with Bruckner. He did the American premiere of Bruckner 4 with the New York Philharmonic, for instance. So it's hard to imagine him graduating to modernism because he's so steeped in the musical and aesthetic world of Mahler. How would he have reacted? He certainly could have conducted for Claire de Knock, early Girl Eater. That would have been great. He would have been
Yeah.
a great conductor of Girl Eater, early Schoenberg. That's easy to imagine. But this is a career that was very, very abruptly terminated and just left a gaping hole.
Yeah. One of the themes that we had said that we would be talking about today was memory in music in
Yeah.
general. And you've just written this essay on Ives and Mahler and memory. But it occurs to me as we're kind of going along this conversation here, we've sort of touching on the idea of also institutional memory. And just how actually incredibly ephemeral it is. I think there was a sort of beautiful illusion in much of the post World War II era that these institutions were carved out of stone, that there would always be a Chicago Symphony and a Vienna Philharmonic and so on. When you talk about Zeidel in New York and the fact that this biggest ever audience for Wagner disappeared with him, I mean that's quite a thought. And likewise, the NBC Symphony disappears uh, once their conductor is gone. Um, I mean, I feel more and more like I'm always kind of reminding people, it's like, look, there's no guarantee that any of this will be here in 5 years unless we make the case for why it's important. So why is it important to have orchestras in this day and age? Maybe along those lines, with what you started with in South Africa, you know,
You
what's
know,
what's the reason that classical music wants to survive and needs to survive there post-apartheid?
when you mention institutional memory, this is a side topic, but Zeidel is not remembered at the Metropolitan Opera, and Zeidel is not remembered at the New York Philharmonic, and Zeidel is not remembered at Carnegie Hall at all. Never is there a memorial event. Um, I don't think his name is even known. You've asked a question that's very hard to answer at this particular moment in time. I'm obsessed with cultural memory. I can't imagine life without cultural memory, although we're beginning to get a glimpse. What what seems to me a problem with contemporary music in the United States is that it lacks cultural memory. I call it makeshift music. It's very eagerly acquisitive and open-eared to an array of present-day influences. But what I don't encounter is the the channel of tradition, lineage, influence, forebears that has always inspired composers and instructed composers in the past. There's a dialectic between the past and the present. Look at any of the so called great composers and how deeply indebted they are to music already composed, which they know and have studied. We have composers today, I won't mention any names, who are composing operas and orchestral works which don't even attempt to draw inspiration from the past. So this may be a new cultural moment and a new kind of creativity, which I think would be unprecedented in Western culture and civilization. What we know, beginning with the Greeks, is a, a style of, of creativity that, that feeds on roots, that feeds on past experience. And now we have composers who don't feed on past experience, audiences that don't feed on past experience. I could mention pianists who are very famous today who do not belong to any lineage. I'm not talking about Trifonov, you know. I'm talking about other pianists who are just coming out of the blue. And that's okay. I mean, in principle, you could have a very exciting pianist who in no way pays homage to tradition. But personally, I don't get it. I mean, for me, it's much more satisfying to hear Sergei Babayan and Trifonov play Rachmaninoff with a full awareness of a Russian tradition of composition and performance than to hear pianist X play Rachmaninoff. Uh, very, it's exciting, but it's for me, it's shallow. Not because they're a shallow person, but because they're not part of a lineage.
I think this is it's a it's a problem that you see in classical music and in pop culture,
Hmm.
and not in a lot of other musical traditions, and not historically in classical music, but certainly in much of the last decade, which is a sort of association that new is progressive and therefore better, and old is regressive and therefore conservative and
Yeah, yeah,
bad.
absolutely.
Um, and you look at a tradition like jazz, which on one level is driven by innovation and improvisation, but all of the jazz musicians I know are so deeply aware of being part of a tradition and being, building on the blocks of the previous generation. I mean, no one knew more about Dizzy Gillespie than Miles Davis because he was his slightly younger contemporary. Dizzy knew his Louis Armstrong backwards and forwards and inside out. You know, Art Blakey is kind of credited with mentoring all these amazing young musicians through the Jazz Messengers, and a big part of his mentoring was, you need to go listen to this, and you need to go listen to that, and you need to understand uh, how we got to the language of today. Uh, and in contemporary music, in order to be new, you have to almost cultivate a sort of amnesia of musical memory because
Yeah.
it's almost impossible these days to uh, come up with something that really hasn't been done before. And so what you have is this sort of the cult of the program note, where the composer persuades us that the first note of this piece is something that no one has ever done in the history of music, and it's something like, this piece begins with the cataclysmic sound of the entire orchestra playing a unison middle C. You say, well, there's actually hundreds of pieces that start like that, and you're just kind of building this all in the preface that we haven't heard those other pieces, and we're going to be hoodwinked by this. Somehow you're doing something completely new. And often, what you end up with is, maybe that's because the composer didn't know that it's been done because they're trying so hard to be innovative. They're
Well,
not.
you've undertaken a mission to champion British composers of the present who do espouse lineage,
Mm.
and certainly sounds like a necessary and original mission to me. We don't have composers like that that I'm aware of in the United States, but you've got this residual group, I guess, in Britain who come out of the traditions of Elgar and Vaughan Williams or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possibly a little bit, that they've just been emerging over the parapet over the last 30 years or so. I mean, there was a similar modernist age here where anyone who was engaged with tradition was looked at as being very second rate. Um, but I think somehow they never quite managed to kill off Benjamin Britten, and that kind of left a little bit of a thread there that then people like Tippett and John McCabe and more recently David Matthews could uh, could build on. Um, but there was certain, a lot of these composers, whether it's Philip Sawyers or Steve Alcock, I think they all felt like there was a absolute zero tolerance for what they were trying to do when they were young in the 70s and early 80s. In fact, Philip, was he wanted to go to study composition, and they basically said, no, we don't teach composers who write this kind of music,
Is
and
this a British phenomenon, or are there analogous developments on the continent? It's certainly not to be found in the United States.
I think there are uh, in places, I would say more like Scandinavia, which
Uh-huh.
seems to have had a healthier relationship with musical tradition. And you see,
I
people
see.
like Rautavaara, just, off the top of my head, Pedersen, who've been able to both establish their works in the repertoire while engaging with musical traditions a bit more.
Well,
Uh,
maybe that's a legacy of Sibelius,
yeah.
and maybe there's a legacy of Shostakovich.
Yeah.
that's comparable. We don't have a Sibelius or a Shostakovich in Germany or France or Italy or the United States.
Um, and I think, it wasn't always easy for that kind of music in Germany, uh, because of the sort of post-war
Totally, totally,
Adorno thing of, you can't have beautiful music after Auschwitz.
absolutely. I mean, it's completely understandable. They experienced such a rupture. We didn't, you didn't,
And I
but
would
the Germans absolutely did.
and I would say that even such extremely modernist composers as someone like Bernd Zimmermann, that's still very traditional music. It's
Yeah,
just extremely dark, extremely demanding, extremely out there.
yeah,
But it's very clearly, an extension of one sort of post-Wagnerian
right.
cultural line as opposed to a reset. Stockhausen's a bit more of a reset. Uh,
Yeah,
but and there were, figures like Hartmann as well, who was, a legitimately great symphonist.
it's a huge topic that the Germans they had to reset.
Yeah.
Then everybody else thought, okay, we have to reset too. I think of Regie Theater in American opera in those terms.
Yeah.
I understand why opera after World War II in Germany had to turn the page, especially because of Wagner's association with Hitler. So you had these directors like Kupfer and Friedrich and um, Felsenstein uh, trying to find a new way that wasn't tainted. But then that became influential everywhere, including the United States. And that's a style of producing opera that seems to me most appropriate for audiences that already know the pieces. When we here in this poor country that I happen to inhabit had our first look at Busoni's Dr. Faust at the City Opera and at the Metropolitan Opera, how I would have preferred a a staging that followed the composer's intentions because none of us had ever seen this opera before,
Yeah.
right? And now you have audiences that have never seen Aida or never seen La Boheme. I just I think that this phenomenon of régie théâtre, which is sometimes ostensibly a tactic for introducing new audiences,
Hmm.
operas, it, it backfires in so many ways. Uh, and yet it made sense in Germany.
Yeah.
It made sense in Bayreuth. Uh, it
When I
doesn't
think
make
it works
sense.
best is when it's about stripping away a level of sort of artifice around the performance traditions and things that, for some reason or another feel historically or emotionally remote to a modern viewer. But what's interesting, I mean, I think the Kupfer ring cycle, the first one he did with Barenboim, is very good in that sense, but it's also kind of hilarious in how dated it is in a different way. It's in sort of, ditching the horns and the shields and all of that. There's a fantastic visceral energy to that whole production, and the orchestra and the singing is all fantastic as well. But it really does look like a postcard from the 1980s now. It's which is, not necessarily a bad thing, but you know if you're not careful, you do end up chasing your tail. And what a lot of reimagined opera is now is instead of being about stripping away artifice, it's like adding it on in spades. And
We
it's like,
understand why Kupfer happened. We
mhm,
understand why Charot happened. We understand why Friedrich happened. Uh, there's no understanding what happens at the Met when, I mean, this recent staging of Carmen, which two people, I went to see Carmen at the Met, right? Because two people said to me, this is the lowest point in the history of the house. And I thought, wow, that sounds interesting,
yeah,
right? And there's no reason or logic for this particular production. Um, so, what I'm trying to say is when you saw the Cooper Ring, I don't know the Berlin Cooper Ring. I know Cooper's Flying Dutchman. I actually attended the premiere at Bayreuth. And yes, if you look at Cooper's Flying Dutchman today, it seems dated, but it was thrilling uh, at the moment. And one understood completely why these guys were revisiting Wagner as they were as part of a historic trajectory
Yeah.
of opera and operant performance. Whereas the Carmen at the Met, there's 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 absolutely no reason for it.
No, no, that's really interesting. I mean, there's also that sort of tick box of like, things like, it's got to have Nazis, it's got to have bondage, it's got to have nudity, otherwise it's not contemporary opera. And you think it's like, come on, this is just getting to be, uh, a tick box list of cliches that every opera production's got to have these days.
Our whole discussion, Ken, is about how to keep things going
Yeah.
at a moment of crisis. And you're way ahead of the game. I don't know any other conductor, with the possible exception of David Geyer in South Dakota, who has such a capacious vision of what the hell they're doing
Thank
and
you.
why they're doing it. But that's very unpopular today.
Um,
It didn't used to be. I mean,
yeah,
Koussevitzy had a capacious vision.
yeah,
Stokowski had a capacious vision. Bernstein, very capacious. What's his importance today, I think, increasingly is the capacity of his vision. What did he care about? The future of the arts is what
yeah,
he cared about, right?
yeah.
And name conductor X today and ask yourself, what do they care about? And you know, it's a tiny aspiration and mostly about themselves.
Well, we gotta keep the flames burning as best we can, and keep cranking out the new work as much as we can. I think this has definitely got to be part one of a few of these because I've got like 10 more questions that we didn't get to. Uh, but in the
Thank you.
meantime,
Yeah.
thanks a lot. And for viewers, in the description box below, you can see links to Joe's blog. Go read the Ives and Schoenberg stuff in particular. Uh,
Ah, that one. Okay, Ken, thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you. Yeah.
Cheers, Joe. Speak soon.